Good morning, viewers. Welcome to Frankly Speaking with Vibhuti Jha. A few weeks ago, we talked about Kashmir, Article 370, abrogation of 35A, and as it always is true, that every major event, or even a minor one, has interesting impact and implication in the communities we live in the lives of people, and the country at large. So let's today evaluate that since August until now, what has been the impact implication of this very historic step in the case of Indian polity, and what is going to happen going forward. A few weeks ago, we had the great pleasure of listening to Dr. Rakesh Kaul, who is a Kashmiri and who has been very deeply involved in the Kashmir affairs within the country as well as outside. As you know, he's a prolific author, a remarkable CEO and running many businesses, philanthropist. But to add to one of his real good achievement, very happy to break that news to you here, that Dr. Kaul has been invited to India's largest literary festival, which is annually held in Jaipur. He has been invited to be the speaker there. So congratulations, Dr. Kaul. Welcome.
Mr. Not doctor. My wife is a doctor, but Mr. Kaul.
Okay. But people have addressed you as Dr. Kaul sometimes.
I think they just do it out of respect.
So respectfully,
yes,
Mr. Kaul. So congratulations for the invitation for Jaipur Literary Festival.
Yeah, I think this novel, Dawn, The Warrior Princess of Kashmir, which Penguin has published, is beginning to catch the imagination of the public. It's a very different novel.
Right. So from CEO, entrepreneur, and literary guy, what a pleasure to have him in the studio to talk to us about the various elements that have sprung up ever since the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A. Mind you, this is a historic moment in the life of the country, something that the opponents said it will never happen in 100 years. Prime Minister Modi made that astute move, calculated, to ensure that the people's lives are saved, the implementation is done, and the world is watching with bated breath as to what will be next there. What we have indeed noticed is that how the left-wing humanitarian relief people are talking about human rights violations. Somebody said on Twitter that the social media things, people have not heard from WhatsApp and Twitter for last 90 days or whatever days it is. But the important part is that even before the advent of social media, there was a freedom in Kashmir, Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh. There is a thing called freedom exists. Freedom is not necessarily related to technology-enabled communication tools. One needs to have freedom from death, freedom from corruption. We need freedom from mandated behaviors that only if you do this, then this will happen. There is a freedom from living a life that is free of fear. These are the freedoms which are more essential to life and living than abrogation or suspension of technology-enabled tools that one uses in communication. So, Rakesh ji, it is very interesting to have you back here so soon. And the impact and implication that I love these two words, because small or big events, they all make a mark. So how do you look at this from in the last 3 months and as we stand today?
So thank you for having me here, Vibhuti Ji. Let's first start with the impact on the Kashmiri Muslims in the valley, because that has not been reported in the mainstream media, and there are some profound changes that have already been disclosed. The first is, it's pretty clear that the Modi doctrine is to break the oligopoly, these families who had turned Kashmir into a sheikhdom, and give power to the people. And already we see evidence of that in two dramatic moves. The first is that Kashmir had always lagged in the panchayat system, and now elections have been held, and sarpanches have been elected, and they have been empowered, and they'll be given funding. That's a huge grassroots democracy movement. That is empowerment of the people. The second thing, which has not been covered, but actually will be of much greater significance, is that the major shrines in the valley, the Muslim shrines in the valley, control had been taken over by the religio-political system, and a J&K Waqf board had been created, which essentially extracted all the revenues that was coming out of those. What the government has done is they have basically, from when you read between the lines, disbanded that board, and now these shrines are going to report to the central, the national Waqf board, as is true of the rest of the country. The financial implications of that is that the central Waqf board only keeps 7% of the collections. So the rest of the money stays within the community. Most importantly, what it does is that it permits Kashmir to go back to its peer culture, where local shrines, local holy people were looked up to, as opposed to the centralized command and control system that had been introduced, which was then pushing Wahhabism top down. So these are two very profound changes. But the third one that will now increasingly begin to show its face is that the government has already identified 17,000 canals of state land. A canal is a unit of measure in Kashmir. There is such a slew of projects that have already been submitted that are looking for the state land to go ahead. We will start seeing these projects get approval because they will need to get land, and my prediction is that come summer, you will start seeing huge infrastructure development happen in the valley, and the face of Kashmir will change for the betterment of the local people. They'll be more empowered. They will see private enterprise at work as opposed to a rotten government political patronage system, and they will like it.
I'm sure they will, because this is a fabulous information that you have shared with all of us here. The important part here is that, we used to hear the stories that in the entire state of Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, the problem areas were only 3 or 4 specific districts where the terrorism was festered and fomented by the opponents of, the so-called Azadi movement. Now, the question arises here is that we talked about the freedom part of it. We have seen several, placards or hoardings in the United States, Free Kashmir, Stop Genocide. And I was saying that, hey, Kashmir is already free. So is the cultural and spiritual, status of Jammu, Ladakh has been established. Kashmir had problem in only select areas. The time has come to demand that it is a Pakistan-occupied Kashmir that deserves freedom. So that is very important to, get into the dialogue and discussions. But here, tell me one thing, how this entire politics of the local Waqf and the development, how did that suffer? I mean, do you mean to say that the family's control on the Kashmir finances and the political life was so deep and so perverted that they totally ignored the will of the people of the Kashmir area?
Well, roughly $45 billion of Indian taxpayer money went into Kashmir. And it's Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, nobody else, who made the comment that while there was a lot of leakage in government programs all over India, in Kashmir, less than 4 pennies on a rupee, 4 cents on a dollar, ultimately found its way to the end recipient. So you can just imagine the scale of what in my last show I said was best described as criminal entrepreneurship. And it just is unprecedented anywhere else in the world as to how much this oligopoly, which was a combination of political leaders, religious leaders, and basic terrorists, how much they have extracted in the system. And so, I basically make the fundamental observation that human beings are ultimately driven by incentives. And unfortunately, in Kashmir for the last 70 years, it paid to oppose India. And that's what is going to change. The system of incentives to oppose India has disappeared, and now they will have to act in a way where the game of internationalizing Kashmir, which we can talk about more in depth, but that game of internationalizing Kashmir, the game of always stoking the fault line about Kashmir's status to get gains out of it, that is gone. Now Kashmiri leadership, whatever that leadership emerges, will have to, in a democratic setup, compete on the basis of local governance. And so the will of the people will be empowered through that process also.
Talking about the will of the people, and that's the important one, the typical picture that people have seen is the demand for azadi, stone throwing. And I go back to my previous statement that these were all, fomented and, part of a conspiracy. Only select group of people, children used to throw stones being paid by our Napak neighbor, as I prefer to call them. And how will this group of people or majority, they will definitely come back to the Indian part of it, particularly Indian point of view, particularly now they see that the economic benefits will reach them. So how do we control? It takes one dynamite to destroy a building. It takes thousands of hands to build a structure. So how will these dynamites in the hands of these terrorist elements and so-called Napaki intent, how will that be addressed? How will that be controlled?
So let's first be very clear that if there's one nation on earth that doesn't support Azadi for Kashmir, it is Pakistan.
Exactly.
So let's be very, very clear about that.
Yeah.
And so to the degree that there is any illusion within Kashmir as to what Pakistan intends to do with Kashmir, one only needs to go and look at Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, where the per capita income of the Kashmiris on the other side of the border is estimated, I think Teresa Schaefer, not anybody less. I think if data tells me, if I remember the data, it's anywhere from 1/3 to 1/5 of the Indian side. And then, of course, they statutorily removed any autonomous status on their side. So let's be very clear that there's no sympathy or space for Azadi of Kashmir on Pakistan's side.
Right.
So now let's talk about the people who are being used to foment trouble on the Indian side, and how do we shrink the space for this terrorist, separatist movement. And the key starting point to shrink that system is essentially to make sure that you take away the safe houses that exist in the valley for this network. Right now, the only mandate, which is a progress and step forward, is to, when you see a terrorist, the Indian security grid moves in and they basically, finish off that person. The episode that happened in London on London Bridge, that video where people saw what the police did, I think goes a long way to show that...
You are talking about the Usman Khan thing,
yes,
right? Yes,
it goes a long way to show that, look, what the Indian security forces are doing, and in London, remember, the police was not surrounded by 5,000 people throwing stones at them.
Correct.
Is a remarkable testimony to the restraint that the Indian security forces show in those conditions. But at the end of the day, there is this network support system. And now I think India has to decisively take the next step and get the message out that if you are harboring a terrorist, you are an accessory, you're going to be as guilty as the person who is actually a terrorist. And yes, India has instituted incentives for rewards leading to the capture of a terrorist, but the earlier they reach out and say, hey, I got a problem here, the better.
And that's very important because this Usman Khan incident in London, where he was killed on the bridge, and he's Pakistani origin, though UK citizen, and that he had ambitions and dream to have a terrorism school in Pakistan to disrupt life in Jammu and Kashmir area is something that Indians and India has to take cognizance of. And that brings us to the next stage of conversation. And that
Can we just stop?
Okay.
It's not just India.
It is global.
Let's just take a minute and talk about first its implications for UK and what its learning is for the US. We are here in the US.
We will do that in the next segment. We will
That's
certainly do that.
Okay.
That's what I was saying,
Yeah.
that in the next segment we will talk about how this entire issue has become a global issue.
Yes.
And how the global leadership must
Yes.
respond to that.
Yes.
Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this short break. Welcome back. We were talking about the London incident, and this brings back the conversation to the impact of terrorism or the way of life that terrorist leads, whether it is dictated by a philosophy or a theology or a faulty concept of humanity. Put it in any which way you want. But there is an implication for the rest of the world about it. So those of you who have followed it must remember that Usman Khan was of a Pakistani origin, a UK resident citizen, and he had a global agenda to create terror and take reprisals based on Kashmir as an issue. The question here is that why is the West, why is the West bending backwards to accommodate this faulty notion that if we give to them, they will become part of us, whereas they are not interested in becoming part of you. Think about it like in India. I mean, thousands and thousands of temples have been destroyed in India. We see the evidence of a destroyed temple and a superstructure of a mosque installed there. Yet, the democratic process, we had to take so many years to have the Ram Mandir resolved. We had to prove, not only that, as a part of an appeasement, I don't know why, the 5 judges gave 1 acre each to give a space of land of 5 acres to these guys to build a mosque. So this is the kind of reciprocity our system shows, but they are going on appeal against this judgment. So when the opponents, or I consider that thought as an evil, ought to take advantage and abuse the options that we give, then we have to kind of tighten a belt. The West is bending backwards to accommodate the Islamic theology the way it is. America is also very receptive to the concept of human rights and human freedom. So many congressmen and US Congress people have filed, moved resolutions to condemn India on the so-called human rights violations, whereas importantly enough, it is a human life violation that was happening in that part of the world. Your thoughts on that?
Okay, and that's well said. First, let's start with the London situation. When I was talking to my sources in London, they made a very chilling statement. They said, there are many Usman Khans walking the street of London. He just happened to go crazy in a very spectacular way. See, Vibhuti Ji, I will answer you why in a second, but let me give you a fact. Elections are happening in UK, I think on December 12th, is it?
Yeah.
The Pakistani population and its community is around 4% of the total population.
Right.
Their Pakistanis themselves are running in 16% of the seats. So they are punching 4 times their weight. And so it's not a surprise that a desperate Labour Party has turned its back against the Jewish people, who have basically advised their people to not vote Labour, and turned its back against the Hindus, who are actually there building their country. And I think it was Nicholas Taleb who wrote that interesting book, The Tyranny of the Minority.
Right, right.
If there is a group, it doesn't matter how small it is, if it has conviction, if it has desperation, and if it's willing to use fair means and foul, they can travel very far. But if there is no opposition, then they can take over. And this is the problem with Indians. The Indians fundamentally do not have a political theology. They don't. And the best way to learn about yourself is to hear what your enemy has to say about you. Muhammad Jinnah, the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, once said that Pakistan would always win its wars against India. He turned out to be wrong, but the reason he gave was a very interesting reason, insightful reason. He said, you know, the Indians, they're basically a nation of shopkeepers. So this shopkeeper mentality, that is what he saw about us, this we have to change. We have to fundamentally realize that we can't take the system that we are a part of as granted. That this system can turn hostile on you very quickly, as we found in Africa. Right? And so it's essential that Indians who are beneficiaries of the system and who contribute to the system also protect the system based on the learnings that we bring as an immigrant about some of the things that are happening in terms of globalization of terror. So the most dramatic example of that swing is the example of Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front. Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front is an organization that's banned in India. It's been declared a terrorist organization. This organization had all three elements that characterize this theology. It had a religious aspect, it had a political aspect, and it had a military aspect. And in London, they actually created something called the National Army, and some of their people shot dead an Indian diplomat, I think his name was Ravi Mhatre, and the case was heard in the British courts, and a couple of their guys were actually convicted in the British court. Today, JKLF has become one of the key endorsers of the Labour Party. Today, a certain gentleman who sits in London and is described as JKLF's diplomat in London is busy running around doing fundraisers for the Labour Party. This is the internationalization of a global terrorist organization. And so until Indians educate the West to their unique learnings and oppose it, these people will take over.
And that's the very important point, because there are, we all have our own interactions and experiences of dealing with people. And I remember you talked about the nation of shopkeepers. I was in Sharjah, and in Sharjah there was a cricket match going on between India and Pakistan. Believe it or not, and I was live there. I'm not telling you a story. The entire Pakistani crowd was shouting, "Bikte hain sale, bikte hain, do aane ke bikte hain." They were shouting. They had, my Pakistani friend had told me that you guys are losing today, and because monies have been played and your guys have been taken over, you will lose this match, and they did. And that, in that context, because of this information that I had, this hurt me. And I asked several Indians there, why don't you shout? You know what was their response? They said, "Hamari tasveerein le lete hain," and then they harass us. So that brought me to another thought process, that majority of us Indians, whether you or I, we are working in Western countries, right? Or blue collar, red collar, white collar, whatever it is. People are working in Middle East. We are job seekers in these parts of the world. For us, thus, peaceful as we are, becoming compliant and accepting of whatever is given is a fait accompli. So we tend to stay quiet. We are not vocal people. We are not assertive people. And that brings us to the second topic of a conversation that I had, which was a long time ago, with a senator, a state and central senator, When they said to me, I don't know why, but they said, why don't you give Kashmir to Pakistan and Khalistan to Punjabis and you will be peaceful forever? And I responded by saying that what if Hawaii tomorrow declares independence, would you let it happen? No way. I said, what about the blacks who are so racially abused and insulted in this country, feel discriminated? If they move to Montana and South Dakota and declare that as a black gold land, separate country, would you let it happen? They said no. I said, what about the Latinos from Southern California, New Mexico and Texas? They say we want to go back to Mexico and we want to declare independence. Would you let it happen? No. I said, then why don't you leave us to ourselves? So the West's imperialism, which died long time ago, it is like who was the foreign minister of Britain who, looking in the Lakshman's cartoon, I remember, he was looking through the binocular and saying, the empire we ruled is coming back to us. So you sow the seeds of imperialism in this way. Today they are again trying to talk about human rights without respecting the scenario that these people do not accept your concept of human rights. So we have to, Hindus have to, Indians have to, we are a multicultural society. We have to become more assertive about it. What is missing in us becoming assertive?
So, a couple of things. First, talking about the difference between the Pakistani and the Indian perspective. If you just take the middle class in the two countries, a Pakistani middle class family, if you ask them, where would you like your son to go? They'll instantly say the Pakistani army, because that's the fastest route for upward mobility, right, status, wealth. Pakistani army is probably the owner of 1/3 of Pakistan. Middle class Indian family, the army would be the last. They want them to go into IIT, they want them to become a doctor or whatever, right? So it's a fundamental difference in value system. Now, India will win with that value system, and we have the strategic depth that we can produce more brave warriors than Pakistan can. The fundamental problem is that Indians think that the world sees them the way we see them. And once we understand that Pakistan will never forgive India for breaking it up in two, we need to understand that Bangladesh remains something that Pakistan can never reconcile itself. Because every time any Pakistani reads about the history of Pakistan, what will he read? He'll read that his country was broken into half,
right,
by a Jewish general,
right,
General Jacob. That's of right. The Indian army, right, made Pakistan sign That's the right. instrument of surrender. Right. So you have to understand from their point of view, they can never reconcile with that. So they want revenge. And so I'm not surprised that this gentleman over a cocktail chatter expressed that sentiment, that they're looking for revenge. Let's be clear in our understanding of that. And so if you don't understand how somebody is looking at you or approaching you, then you can never develop a proper response. Now, here's the good news. Here's the good news. We are in what I call a Guru Tegh Bahadur movement. When Aurangzeb went to his religious clerics and he said, what is it about India that unlike any other country, we have not been able to eliminate the indigenous thought process, civilization? And they said, look, you can never do it until you take the Kashmiri Hindus and you convert them. Because that's the fountainhead. You get them to accept what you believe in, and everybody else will follow. That's when Aurangzeb started his program, and that's when the Guru Tegh Bahadur great sacrifice occurred. So the lesson is this: Kashmir is the unification test of India. You can see even today, now that Pakistan, in a desperate gambit, is throwing everything in the international world circuit to try and light and burn a fire in Kashmir. They're doing everything possible. What is the one thing that has united Indians around the world in India? It's Kashmir.
Right.
Every Indian has come together and said, on this issue, we are going to oppose.
Right.
We are going to counter the narrative of lies. So last week we saw two really sad articles. One was written in a Western magazine out of New York. And it was so sad that this reputed journalist who wrote a best-selling book on the spread of Islamism in Afghanistan and Iraq, what American forces were trying to fight, and he was a best-selling book. It was so sad that when he went to Kashmir surreptitiously, he didn't see any evidence of Islamism. And what is worst is that Rana Ayub, his local reporter, told him to wear the outfit that the local security people would have believed is a Kashmiri Pandit walking through, right? He would have been fair, he was wearing a kurta pajama. That's a Kashmiri Pandit in that context.
Correct.
And he didn't have the sensitivity that he was entering the valley, impersonating a community against whom genocide was committed by the same people that he's trying to write sympathetically about. That is the kind of awareness and education that we have to create. Until we help them understand how they are being manipulated, how they are being taken for a ride by duplicitous people. He wrote glowingly about Rana Ayub's book, but he didn't have the integrity, and I'm sorry to say this about a great reporter, he didn't have the integrity to report that the Supreme Court of India trashed the same book, calling it filled with conjecture, speculation that were baseless and unsupported. That is sheer manipulation.
And that's where we were talking about the complacency that we as a people have in the country, in the world around us. So we are least demanding, we are least asking questions, we are very successful in our own individual spheres, but we have not been able to bring about a collective clout that is required to make impact and make an implication to change the perception that exists about us. So that's very, very critical that you talked about. I read that entire thing. It was interesting that they served a purpose. So if I have to do something illegal that serves my purpose, it is justified according to their analysis of their own scriptures. That's where we have to be careful. And I totally agree with you on that this is something which is very, very critical. I recall a 1977 December story, crystal clear event happened with me. We were four of us, a Bengali, a Malayali, a Bihari, myself, and a Sikh from Bengal who had never been to Punjab, who had never been to Golden Temple. And this is a crucial conversation because we watched a Seth Nagji football tournament. First night game we saw, Mohan Bagan versus JCT Mills Fagwada. Mohan Bagan won 2-0. And we were walking back. We were students, we were walking back. And he suddenly erupted on one statement that I made. Mohan Bagan played great and they beat JCT 2-0. And this Sikh friend of mine, we used to call him a Bengali Sardar because he was so quiet and very docile, very friendly, very loving. He burst. He's saying, you Hindu referees defeated a Sikh team. And I said, that's a bizarre statement to make. Cut the story short, that was the first time I heard from him, 77 December, हम अपना country लेके रहेंगे, उसका नाम है खालिस्तान. I was astounded. I said, you mean to say Indian intelligence doesn't know? And he said in a very derisive, very strong condemning words, with all kinds of beautiful floral abuses, as you can imagine, we can't say on the TV, you Hindus are that. You are a brainless twit. हमारे सारे काम हो रहे हैं बाहर. And that's what triggers me about this one, is that 5 years later, he told me in 77 December, 4 or 5 years later, our agitation is going to start. Exactly Asian Games 1982, 60 people died in a revolt or whatever happened. He came to my house and I asked him, Dipsy, is that what you had in mind? He said, yes, some lives have to go to achieve a goal. That's what it triggers a memory in my mind, that we are so complacent, we are so disunited, that we try to look at things from other people's perspective without realizing that, hey, we are getting hurt in the process. So the rules of law, which are designed to enable a proper democratic life, somebody comes and abuses that, then you have to have a separate set of rules to deal with those who are not criminals, but a completely terrorist mentality. So, great conversation. Stay tuned. I don't want to stop talking, but we've got to take a break. We'll be back right after this short break. Welcome back. Talking about this exciting subject matter, Rakeshji, you referred to that how the entire country has come together on this Kashmir matter. I recall this because in 1989, when the first bullets were fired, I was in Srinagar that night. Our company was there. We were doing our marketing plan. Bullets were fired. We were looked upon with significant amount of suspicion. Our movements there were always a group of people who were following us. So it is personal. This was the first time my hands went into the snow. We experienced snow, and I remember my son's delight. So it is personal in a way, not as deep as you are, because yours are, but there is a connect there. And so the point of the matter is, in the Congress rule, the entire plight, the suffering, the genocide, as you mentioned in the last program, it was called near genocide, not genocide, as if there is a thing called halfway pregnant or not full pregnant. So the question here is that how did the Congress party change the narrative for the Muslim vote bank? The pain of Kashmiri Hindus and Pandits, call them as you like, was never felt by anybody. It was never felt. We only knew that it was a tragedy. It was a tragedy happening. Today, people now feel that difference. You have fought this battle for 30 years, and you owe kudos and applause from everybody that you kept this battle going on. So today, the entire country is with you, but there is one thing which I always worry about. The Hindus are traditionally too individualistic. They believe in Ekla Chalo Re, Bengali poem, rather than being that is a unity has a strength, and there is a strength in unity. What do you see here that in America particularly, like people are talking about human rights violation. And I believe that if there is a human life, if it is violated, human rights come after human life being protected. We need to change that narrative to the West. And we have to educate the EU and United States that you work against Indian interest, it will come to bite you. Because these people are not interested in only India. They are interested in a global domination, because there is a demand that will come, which happens, like you said, 4% of them are 4 times multiplied in terms of in their action plan. They have to become cognizant, and it's up to us, because we are respected, recognized in the community, to build the cloud. How will Hindu-Indian unity come about in this particular perspective?
So you made a couple of points. Let me systematically address all of them. The first thing, and you're absolutely right, Indians have basically been used to a leadership style that always lagged their aspiration. For the first time in Prime Minister Modi, we have a leader who has actually exceeded expectations. So he is actually ahead of us. And so the Indians today are lagging. He took the bold step of removing Article 370, Article 35A, but now the public needs to step up and do its thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Number 2, we have to have the conviction that what India and Prime Minister Modi is doing is going to be very good for the Kashmiri Muslims. And so to the degree that Pakistan tries to create a Hindu-Muslim divide, to the degree Pakistan tries to create false narratives, we just have to have the conviction this is going to be very, very good for grassroots, average Kashmiri Muslim. Mm-hmm. It won't be so good for the people at the top, but for the masses, it'll be very, very good. And we have to have that conviction. Right. Number 3, we have to recognize something. about our own selves. We do not believe in a monopoly structure. You gave the example of this gentleman, Khalistani, and I'm sorry that living and being born in the soil of India, that he has succumbed to the narrow thinking, sectarian thinking, monopolistic thinking, whereas India is all-embracing, it is multiplicity. That multiplicity will also continue at the organization level. But the one thing that is possible is unity of purpose and action. That is possible. And one can, and Indians can demonstrate that all kinds of organizations, all kinds of groups can join together when it is something. And we have seen that at the time of independence, we have seen that at the time of the war against China. So we have seen the multiplicity of India become unity. Kashmir represents that. Kashmir does represent that. Now, once we accept that Kashmir represents something, then it's time for action. Then we have to say, look, what are the things we have to act upon? Now, with all due respect, the Congress party wanted to sweep the Kashmiri Pandit genocide under the rug. Okay, that's water under the bridge. But the reality is, Kashmiri Pandit genocide is the needle that punctures the Pakistani tire, right? Any narrative they try to create about Kashmir gets exposed. That it's an Islamist project, they want to create Sharia, and they want to merge it to Islamist Pakistan. So it's very important that Kashmiri Pandit genocide be a central arm of any strategy, whether it's a narrative, whatever. In that score, with all due respect, the BJP government has not made much progress either. They have given some lip service, but in official records, in the Valley of Kashmir, in revenue records, we are still written down as an absconder, and Government of India calls us a migrant. That's got to be changed. I mean, we got to have frank talk on your show, right?
Right.
Now, Government of India under BJP has had 6 years. Time. Give them IDP status. No ifs, buts, and ands. Only then do we have a legitimate way in the international circles of talking about Kashmiri Pandit genocide. Second, and this is a real issue, we really have to confront the false narrative of Pakistan head on. There's no way around it. We have to organize ourselves. We don't have an ISI that organizes it for Pakistan through their embassies. But it's okay. We are an independent people, we are a smart people, we have more resources. Let's get organized and let's provide the truth. And you know, over time, we will completely win. But in order to win, we have to make the effort. We have to create purpose-driven organizations. If we create purpose-driven organizations, unification will happen because people will come into those organizations. People are very, very angry at what Pakistan and some of their small sympathizers in the US Congress and in the media are trying to do by promoting a false narrative.
And this entire false concept of false narrative is important. It's very important, and we Indians have to take cognizance of that fact that the narrative created is a part of a gameplay. Remember, drawing the cricket analogy, cricket has changed. It's no longer only 5-day test matches. There is T20 and there is a 1-day 50-over match. Then there is a test match. So in our prioritization, unity of purpose, we have to again categorize what now and what next.
Yes.
So for example, the fact that Pakistan middle class is also now talking about a nuclear war.
Yes.
Forget about the fact that Pakistan Prime Minister talked about nuclear war, jihad, and a bloodbath in India. Openly talked about. There is no need to prove it because it's there on the United Nations General Assembly speech of the Pakistani Prime Minister. No action, no vilification has been done, and we are not been able to make that as an issue. That this is where this particular country doesn't have to go into FATF dark grey list. It has to be blacklisted. Because even today they are now talking about a nuclear war because as you rightly said, the toy is taken away from their hand. And in the negotiation part, in this abrogation of 370, India is a beneficiary, Kashmiris are beneficiary, Ladakhis are beneficiary, Jammuites are beneficiary. Pakistan has no stake left anymore On the contrary, they have to protect their POK. It is rightly called Pakistan occupied Kashmir.
No, I think it's much worse than that.
Okay.
And so again, one has to have clarity on the other side. See, removing Article 370 now represents an existential threat to the Pakistani army.
Totally.
The sole reason that the Pakistani army exists and is able to take the lion's share of the country's resources, where the civilian population essentially is deprived, and it's a bankrupt country that has to go with a begging bowl every year or every second year. If Kashmir is no longer, feasible, then what do they need all this army for, with these generals with their fake medals that have lost every war? I mean, I actually am surprised. I see them with medals and I'm surprised. They've lost every war against India. They've let their country be divided in two. Why in the world do they have all these medals, for God's sake? But nonetheless, that's their problem. But see, this represents a very serious existential threat. I don't want to be alarmist, but I don't want to minimize that what a desperate situation this has created for the Pakistani armed forces, for ISIS, and with the passage of time, as look, internet already has been resumed in the business establishment in Kashmir. Businesses are already using the internet. Of course, they've been told control the social media access, but business starting, that's rolling. And I fully expect over time, internet will roll out even more. So all this stuff will prove to be nonsense talk. But the threat to Pakistan's army doesn't disappear away. With each passing day, the existential threat grows. So it's completely understandable that they are literally desperate, and maybe some stupid fool will do something. But I'm sure the Indian security establishment is watching them like a hawk. And if they attempt anything, that'll be the last lesson that Pakistan will be taught.
I agree with you, and I thank you for bringing the focus on that. And as it always happens with a conversation, it must end, whether we like it or not. So this conversation has been brilliant, and I hope you will come again, because the people need to know more. And at the political level, things that Indians can do in America, get politically engaged, remain involved. And remember, we Indians have a tendency to seek the perfect answer. There is no perfect answer, but there is always a better answer. So better response. Think about it from that point of view. There is no right or perfect answer. It is always in order to look for a better alternative. What is the best response? With these few words, we wish you a very happy weekend and see you again next week. Thank you, Rakesh ji, for joining us today, and congratulations once again for the invitation for Jaipur Literary Festival. That's really awesome, and I'm going to read that book now.
Thank you, Vibhuti ji, for having me. And my last words will be that there are thinking Pakistanis, and they actually understand that this is an opportunity for them to liberate Pakistan from the grip of the establishment, and you will see a counter argument start in Pakistan against this dangerous rhetoric.
With this good news, see you again. Thank you.